Hi, everyone. If Hanukkah is Midrash lacking, and it is, there's not a lot of Midrashim on Hanukkah, then Purim actually is quite the opposite, that there are lots and lots of Midrashim on Purim. The Masechet and the Talmud on Megillah, a very, very large portion of it is Agadata, is stories about the story, which is very interesting. Of course, that's what Midrash is. It's stories about stories. And then in addition to that, there's a Midrash Rabbah, which is extensive collection of Midrashim on Purim. Of course, Midrash is a very strange generic entity. It's very hard to define, and any definition that one gives of Midrash will be insufficient to what it is, because it keeps on overflowing any kind of generic limitation that we want to give to it. So let's start here today. I'm putting the passage up here. This is on the pasuk Lasod Baratzon Ish Va'ish. So this is about the Su'udah that the evil king Achashverosh sets up for everybody in his kingdom, and the Jews come to it. And here it says, Baratzon Ish Va'ish, each accord, he made it, everybody was happy there. So then the Midrash goes, Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ani yotzi midei briosai. I do not fulfill the wishes of all my creations when they are in conflict. V'ata mivakesh lasos karatzon ish v'ish b'noag u'sheba'olam. And but yet you seek to do according to the pleasure of each and every man. How is it possible? It's like a philosophical question to the pasuk, right? How can everybody be happy? Shnei b'nei Adam, and then it gives a mashal. Shnei b'nei Adam, bevakshim Lisa Isha Achas. So you forgive my Ashkenaz. There are two men, and they both want to marry the same woman. And then the Gemara asks, the Midrash asks, can she marry both of them? Ella, of course, not that's implicit. Ella, it's one or the other, meaning really we're getting into the idea that there are limitations to the way in which God makes the world. And that's what the Midrash is really asking, a very philosophical question here in the middle of this Midrashim on the narrative of Purim. Narrative really doesn't matter. What's important is the interpretation of the narrative. So the question is really being asked, well, how can, again, the limitations to God's creation, can God satisfy every person? It's impossible. So the Midrash continues. It gives another mashal. V'chein shtei sfinot shahayu olot beliman. So two ships that go into a harbor. Achat mivakeshet ruach tzvonit, v'achat mivakeshet ruach dromit. They each want a different kind of wind. One wants to go one way, one wants to go the other way. Interesting question why the Midrash brings both of these. One is the case of two people wanting the same, forgive me, object. Two people wanting the same woman. And this is two people who want the universe. They both have the same desired object. Here, they have different aims, and they need God to manipulate the world in such a way that they can be satisfied, and they both can't be satisfied. Can one wind lead both ships simultaneously? Ella ola zeh. Again, it's the same answer. It's one or the other. Now it comes to Achashverosh and Mordechai. Lamachar shnei b'nei adam ba'im lefanecha b'din. Tomorrow, certainly we're in this temporal realm. Tomorrow, two people will come before you, Achashverosh the king, b'din, in judgment. Ish Yehudi v'ish tsar oyev. A Jewish man, and that's Mordechai. It's not named. Oh, it's Ish v'ish, because Mordechai and Haman are both referred to in the Megillah as Ish. That's the license that the Midrash has to make this comparison. Midrashim don't need a lot of license, and in halacha you need a lot of license for interpretation. In Midrash that's not the case. The smallest pretext will allow the rabbis to darshan, that is, to interpret. So two men will come. One is this Jewish man. The other is an adversary and an enemy. It's interesting, right? So there's the Jewish man, and then there's the adversary and the enemy. Will you be able to fulfill the wishes of both of them? miromem lezeh, v'tzolev lezeh. So you're going to, in the end, you're going to celebrate one, exalt one, and hang the other one. I mean, it's interesting. The Midrash really has changed because previous uh, in the previous two comparisons, like the previous two comparisons are not like this one. In the previous two comparisons, there's an equivalence. Here, there's an opposition, not an equivalence, and the Midrash goes out of the way to say it is an opposition, right? The Jewish man and his adversary. The other things were not necessarily adversarial. You have two men with the same desires. They are against one another, but they're not enemies of one another necessarily. The two men who want different winds, they're equal, right? They're equal. But here we have Mordechai and Haman, who are looked at as one is the enemy of another. So it's unsatisfying, I think, in its simple meaning. So I don't even know how we read this. In those other cases, I see what we read it like the natural world is such that God can't grant the desires of every person. So, you go with the tzaddik, I guess, right? You go with a good Jewish man and not his enemy. It's obvious, right? It's obvious. Let's continue with that preliminary reading. Rabbi Huna said in the name of Rabbi Binyamin Bar Levi, "Ba'olam hazeh, b'zman sheruach tzofenet min hashevet, ein ruach dromit min hashevet." So here's a different person, a different maimer here. I don't think the other one is unattributed. Rabbi Huna comes and says, when the north wind is blowing, the south wind is not blowing. And when the south wind is blowing, the north wind is not blowing. Okay. But in the future, aval lasid lavo latid lavo b'kibbutz galiut, in the future to come, at the ingathering of the exiles, b'kibbutz galiut, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ani mevi ruach argestis le'olam, I shall bring a very powerful wind to the world. Sheshtei ruchot mishamshot bo, that the two winds are both used in it. Chadahu diktiv, and then it gives a pasuk from Isaiah. I will say to the north, give them over into the south, do not withhold. And then it goes on and says, Hevia b'nei mirachok ubanatai miksei haaretz, bring my sons from afar, and bring my daughters from the far end of the earth. So here we see, at the ingathering of the exiles, when everybody is brought together, then these seemingly opposite things will exist simultaneously. And there will be a wind that both goes in opposite directions. You know that Freud says of dreams, and it's probably true, that there are no contradictions in dreams, right? You have things that coexist in the dream world that cannot coexist in an everyday world. That there's in that dream world, oppositions come together, where oppositions can exist at the same time. It's interesting here that this is tied to another spatial movement, the ingathering of the exiles who are brought in from the far sides, the far ends of the earth. So north and south come together. It's interesting, at the same time that the people of Israel come together. In the end, which I didn't give to you, the Midrash concludes, Mihu zeh she'osa ratzon yirav. Who is the one who does the will of those who fear him? It is the Holy One, blessed be he. And then it brings a verse from Tehillim, Ratzon yirav yasev et shavatam yishma v'yoshem. It says every day, as we say in Ashrei, the will of those who fear him will do, and their cry he will hear, and he will save them. And that's the end of it. So again, it's interesting. So this ends kind of homiletically, or not homiletically, kind of giving a message. So the complexity of the Midrash, it reveals itself slowly. if we go back to the first part, and we'd have to think about the relationship between what we just read and the first part. In the first part, we have the two men who want the same women, they're equal, the two ships who want different winds. And then there's the end, which says, well, tomorrow, Machar, people will come before you, Achashverosh, in judgment. And I said before, it brings us into the temporal realm. And once we're in that temporal realm, it's clear you have to choose, meaning tomorrow you're going to have this problem, Achashverosh. In the second part of the Midrash, we learn, well, there is a realm in which those oppositions are really, are not so, that we see those oppositions can live together. And the end of the second part is similar to the end of the first part. Who is it who performs the will of those who fear him? It is the Holy One, blessed be he, of whom it is written, the will of those who fear him will do, and their cry he will hear, and he will save them. Even, I think the implication is in this world, those who fear him, even in this world. So there's a sense that just like, and there is a parallel between the first part and the second part. The first part, we have the equivalence, and then the judgment of Mordechai. I was just wondering, as a question, to what extent are Achashverosh and Mordechai, to what extent are Haman and Mordechai opposites in the same way in which the two winds are? Now, it glosses over that question. It's a good Purim question, though, right? Because there is a sense, remember, I'm seeing in my notes over here, I finally read them, that there is the Ad Shelo Yada, the mitzvah on Purim of not being able to recognize the difference between Mordechai and Haman. And here, the temporal realm of Achashverosh is you're going to have to judge one of them. And you should, if you were just, you would judge Mordechai as being the just one, because in time you have to make a choice. So just like at the end of the second part, the history is tilted in the direction of tzaddikim, even though in the infinite world or whatever, the eternal world, those things are mixed together. It's almost like the Midrash here is saying, don't think that those forces are equivalent in the world in which we live in. They're not. They're moving in a direction. All with that said, of course, of what I just said, the question is begged is how much are Mordechai and Haman, how much are they oppositions in the same way in which the two winds are? There's really a kind of a dual movement in Purim. One is to see the tendency of history in ways that are totally unexpected to good, meaning things work out in the end. But there's also, and in future talks, we'll talk about this, there's also a highly antinomian aspect of Purim. That highly antinomian aspect, what I mean by antinomian, it's like anti-law, meaning antinomian is like a 17th century Christian world, where tells you where I am, for a kind of relativism, that things mean what they mean according to perspectives. So there's a kind of antinomian aspect of Purim, a big one. And Ad Shelo Yada is the mitzvah that embodies that. You get to the point where you can't tell the difference between good and evil. Good and evil, it no longer that opposition breaks down. It's strange, and in a way, there's a kind of transcendent oblivion of Purim, the transcendent oblivion of getting to that point. Of course, most of us just end up eating too much food and getting drunk and having to go to sleep. But that's really the ideal. So that's a good start. You see how rich these stories are. I was going to start out by saying, well, really, this is tangential to the Purim story. Of course, it's not. Mordechai and Haman are right in the middle of it, but they are using Chazal are using the Purim story about thinking about ways in which oppositions can coexist or can't coexist in this world and in some future world. And let's, Adkan.